This video is the second in a series of walkthrough videos which are designed to talk through the GCSE History exam papers for the summer of 2024. In this video, we'll be discussing Paper 1, Section B, the Thematic Study. My name's Ben Armstrong. I'm a subject specialist working with Pearson Edexcel, and I specialise in GCSE History. With me is also Katie.
Hi, I'm Katie Matthews. I work for Harris Federation as a senior consultant and deputy lead for history.
So what are we going to cover in this video? Well, you may have already seen the previous video on Paper 1, Section A. We're going to spend a little bit of time looking at what Paper 1 overall looks like. Then we're going to look at some top tips for how you can prepare for the thematic section or Section B of Paper 1. We'll then move on to looking at what the questions look like and how you can get to grips with answering them in a way that will help you to be more effective in the exam. And finally, we'll look at some practical suggestions for revision that will really help you to focus your knowledge and make sure you're revising the right thing. So let's begin by taking a look at Paper 1 and getting to grips with what Section B looks like. So Katie, how does Section B of Paper 1 work?
So Section B is the second part of your exam paper for Paper 1. It's got 36 marks and is worth 70% overall. And you should use this as a good judge for how much time to really spend on this paper. So we would recommend around 50 minutes of your total exam time of 1 hour and 15 to be spent on this section of the paper. Now, this paper is really interesting. It's just focused predominantly on change and continuity over a large expanse of time across British history. So you need to understand your particular topic and how some of the factors have changed and stayed the same from the medieval period right up to the present day.
So how will students know which thematic topic they're studying?
So it will depend on what your teacher has chosen for you to study. There are 4 that are available. You could do crime and punishment, medicine in Britain, warfare in British society, and migrants in Britain. And it will be one of those 4 that you'll be doing. Coupled with the thematic study, there's also the historic environment, which is the first video we produced in part of this series. So do make sure if you haven't watched that one to go back and watch that one as well.
Thanks, Katie. It's really good to be clear on what the topics are. So let's take a look at some top tips. And these top tips are designed to really help you get the most out of approaching this thematic study. So how is it that you can do well on this part of the paper? Well, here's 5 of our very top tips. The first one is very important. Be careful not to waste time writing too much. That might seem an odd thing to say. After all, there can be a tendency to want to put as much down as you know, but it's a good idea to use the number of lines as a rough guide. After all, if you spend too long on a shorter question, one that's worth fewer marks, you might find you run out of time before you get to answer the longer questions. Also, it's a good idea to plan out extended writing questions, especially the 12-mark and the 16-mark questions before you begin writing. It might seem like you're wasting a couple of minutes, but if that makes the rest of your time more effective, then it's time well spent. It's very important to revise your time periods as well as the knowledge. You've got to be able to tell the difference between, for example, the medieval period and the modern period. If you're not sure when things happened and which period's which, it might be easy to get mixed up when you're answering the question. The 4th tip is very important as well. Always try to say something that answers the question. Even if you're feeling a little uncertain on a question, you're not quite sure exactly, it's better to put something down connected to that topic, because writing something might get you a mark, but if writing nothing, well, you won't be able to score any marks at all. Even a simple fact or comment can often be awarded with a mark. And the final one, use past exam papers to practice and ask your teacher for feedback. Your teacher wants to help you. They want to help you reach your potential. So use the resources that are available to you. Another top tip is to be absolutely clear on chronology. Chronology means understanding the order of events and how they fit together through time. It's important on all of your GCSE history papers, but it's especially important on paper 1, section B, because it is about the thematic spread of history over a long period of time. The topics are divided into 4 time periods. We have the medieval period, early modern, the 18th and 19th centuries, and then 1900 to present. It's really important that when you're getting ready for this exam, you make sure you're familiar with the dates and names given to the different time periods. For example, if you're doing medicine, that would be the years circa 1500 to 1700, the medical renaissance in England. It's also important to be familiar with key events and what they mean in terms of change and continuity. Another way you can really help yourself out in preparing for this exam is making sure that you're confident on the key factors. The key factors are issues and trends which either speed up or slow down change and continuity through the period. There's many key factors, but certain ones are named in the specification, which means you need to make sure you understand how these factors relate to your topic. For example, if you study crime and punishment, then the factors are attitudes in society, individuals and institutions, for example, the church and government, and the role of science and technology. Although there's some similarity between the key factors, they are slightly different for each of the 4 thematic studies. So it's important to make sure you know what your factors are and how important they are. Of course, there's other factors as well that you might consider when you're revising. Perhaps your teachers mentioned other factors, but these ones are especially important to be aware of. One way that you can help yourself in thinking about the factors is by thinking about how they changed in importance over the periods of time. Katie, perhaps could you explain how this sort of diagram might be useful to students who are revising?
Yes, so I think it's a really important visual way to think about factors from the medieval period to the present day. So you need to understand the patterns of change, the trends and the turning points, and ultimately the influence that these factors have in inhibiting, which means stopping, or encouraging change within the periods and across several periods in some cases. So if we have a look at, for example, this one in medicine, so I did this many times as part of discussing this with students, and it's a really great revision tool as well. So if, for example, we look at the purple line of the role of the church, so thinking about medicine, ultimately the church as an institution in the medieval period was quite inhibitive of change. So very little change was happening as a result of the church. Then if we map that over time, that begins to reduce, because although we wouldn't say now that there is no influence at all of the church, because some people are still religious and that does impact the way that they view medicine, that has significantly changed across the period of the thematic study. So it's a really great way to think about how you can use your knowledge and understanding and begin to map them over the 4 different time periods of the thematic study.
That's a really interesting way of thinking about it. Thanks for showing that one. Another useful tip is to prepare the language that you might want to use. You see, if we're going to talk about change and continuity, then that means that in your written answers, you're going to need to be able to express how things changed or stayed the same. And it might be that you need to express that at some points things changed more quickly or more slowly. Having the right language can be really useful. This table here shows some of the range of language that's available to you. For example, if you're talking about the speed of change, It has explosive, gradual, slow, fast, swift, hurried, and so on. Similarly, in the last column, if we're trying to say how important a change was, rather than trying to say very important or not very important, well, we have some really good language here: symbolic, important, incidental, revolutionary, and so on. Why not pause the video here and take a moment to look at some of the language here? Maybe you need to check what some of the words mean, and pick out a handful that you might want to use to talk about different types of change and different significance of change. So let's turn our attention to what the questions look like. After all, if you're going to be confident in the exam, one of the ways to do that is to know what the questions are going to look like and how you can approach them effectively. Remember that this is just about section B of the exam paper, which is why here in our table it starts with question 3, then 4, then 5 and 6. Remember that questions 1, 2A and 2B are part of section A of this exam paper, and they've been covered in our first video. The 3 different questions here focus on the issue of change over time. Question 3 is a comparison of either similarity or difference over time, and you'll be asked to explain one way in which something was similar or different to something else. That's only worth 4 marks, so really it's ideal to spend perhaps about 5 minutes on that question. We then have a 12-mark explain why question. You'll be asked to explain why the causes of change made a difference. This question is worth 12 marks, so it needs a little more time, perhaps about 20 minutes. And then there'll be a judgment question. The judgment will look about the development of the thematic study over time. That could be change in continuity, consequence, similarity or difference, significance, or causation. And you'll be asked how far you agree with the statement. This is where you need to have the majority of your time on this exam paper, because it's 16 marks with an additional 4 for spelling, punctuation and grammar. So it's worth perhaps putting aside maybe 25 minutes, a significant part of the time you have on this paper, in order to do a really good job of that question. Let's dig into these questions in a little more detail now. So Katie, the first one, similarity or difference over time.
Let's have a look at an example then. So this question will address either similarity and difference. It will always compare 2 different time periods, for example, ideas about causes of illness in the period 1700 to 1850 and 1900 to present. You need to make sure that you provide supporting detail about each time period, even if the question is about similarity. I've provided you here with an example of an answer from a student from a few years ago. You might want to pause the video now and have a read through the answer. So you will see from your answer that you've got in front of you that this student has done really well. But what makes it so successful? So you can see from the bit that I've highlighted in yellow, the candidate has explained the overall difference very early on in the answer, making it really clear to the examiner that they know what they're talking about. They also then provide specific detail, which is the section of the answer that's in blue, and they've done that for both time periods. So they've talked about trades such as textiles and paper making, which were well respected in the 17th century, and then also about qualifications and skills that weren't accepted in the 20th century. So this student has clearly illustrated a difference between both, provided the specific detail, so they get a level 2, 4 marks out of 4. Now the part that I've highlighted in purple and circled is the student's use of the phrase in contrast, and that's really useful for showing the examiner that you've really focused on the answer. Ben, have you got any other suggestions of kind of language students could use there?
Absolutely, Katie. It's not about having specific language, but using keywords can be a way of showing the examiner what you're trying to say. So if you're trying to show a similarity, even a simple phrase like similarly or likewise can flag up that the next thing you're going to say is very similar to the point you've already made. On the other hand, if you're talking about a difference, well, a phrase like in contrast, whereas, or however shows that the thing you're going to say next is different to what you already identified from the first time period. So this sort of language is a really useful way of approaching the question effectively. The next question is the 12-mark explain why. Now we'll just mention at this point something that we call stimulus points. Stimulus points are those 2 bullet points that you get with many of the questions on the different papers. So although we're going to mention them here for section B, you'll also see these bullet points on papers 2 and papers 3 as well. Stimulus points are really there to help you think about what you might want to talk about in the answer. They don't have to be things that are named in the specification, so they can be written using things that aren't listed in the specification. But that's okay, because they're just there to give you a bit of a help into the question. And if you're not sure what one of them means, or you don't want to use it, that's absolutely fine. The examiners simply choose the 2 bullet points to help you and other students to be able to answer the question and know what sort of things you might want to talk about. And that's why they're optional. One important thing to note is that you should aim to cover 3 different aspects of content. That doesn't necessarily mean you need 3 different reasons, but your answer to get a higher level mark does need to cover 3 different aspects of content. When you're talking about questions 5 and 6, which we'll come to later, they're the 16-mark questions. It's also worth noting that one of the points will relate to the factor in the question, so that will help you to build an answer that supports the question. The other one, on the other hand, might give you information which will perhaps help you to start building an alternative side and balance your answer out. What about planning? At the start of this video, one of the hints we mentioned was the importance of planning out for your longer answers. In other words, question 4 and question 5 or question 6. Plans don't have to be complicated. Plans don't have to be very time consuming. Here's 2 examples from a 12-mark question 4. What you can see here is that the student has just taken a few moments at the beginning in both of the examples to bullet point down things that they might want to mention in the answer. How's that going to help them? Well, this student, when they start writing, is going to know the things they want to talk about, the order they want to mention them in, and it's going to mean, most importantly, that they don't forget something that was really important for their answer. In the top example, you can even see that they've ticked off some of the points as they've mentioned them. Of course, plans don't have to look like this. Some students write their plans in boxes or in mind maps and in different ways. But what's really important is you take a few moments at the start to jot down the ideas you want to include in your answer. So Katie, here's an example of one of our 12-mark explain why questions. This one's from the medicine option. Perhaps you could explain a little bit about how this question works.
Yes, of course. So what is the question actually asking you to do, and what is the examiner going to be looking for? So the question begins always with explain why. And what the examiner is asking you is ultimately, why did it happen? You need to focus on the causes of something. The next bit in green, this is the focus of the question. So you need to explain why this thing happened. And in this example, it's access to medical care and treatment improved. So that's the aspect of change we're looking at. Why did it get better? And then the last bit in purple, which is really important to focus on, is the time period in which you're being asked about. Here, it's the modern period, so that's from around 1900 to the present day. You must make sure that you stay within these date ranges, otherwise you might include material that isn't rewarded any marks. Obviously, as Ben's already mentioned, you get 2 really useful stimulus points. They're there to help you, so use them if they're useful. And obviously, if you don't want to use them, you don't need to. If we move on to look briefly at the mark scheme for this, there are 2 main areas that we're looking at, and these are called assessment objectives. So the bit in red is focused on how well you're analysing your answers. So at the bottom end, it goes from a very simple generalised answer. Level 2, we move up to limited analysis. Level 3, some analysis, mainly directed at the question. And level 4, an analytical explanation, which is directed consistently at the focus of the question and is sustained. So that's how you move through the levels there. Then on the other side, the part in blue, we're going to be looking specifically at your knowledge. So level 1, again, limited knowledge and understanding. Level 2, some accurate and relevant knowledge. Level 3, good knowledge and understanding. And level 4 is precise knowledge and understanding, showing a wide range of knowledge. And it builds on that part that Ben was saying, making sure you've covered those 3 different areas of content and making sure you do that, because you can see the part on level 4, if you haven't done those 3 or more aspects of content, you simply cannot get into that part of that mark scheme, and we obviously don't want that. So how does this work in terms of an answer then? So this extract from explain why access to medical care and treatment improved in the modern period. Pause the video now, have a read through this student's answer, and I'll walk you through how we apply the mark scheme to this. So this one came from 2023. The student has successfully focused on the question very early on. They opened their answer by saying one reason why access to medical care and treatment improved was because of the government. So there they've used a combination of analysis, because of, so due to the government, there was change. And by including the government, that's an area of knowledge and understanding. Then what the student does really successfully is goes on to explain it, providing really specific information there, talking about GPs and other aspects of government action. At the end of this paragraph, they bring it back to that analysis and they bring it back to the focus on the question. And that's really important to get higher up the mark schemes. As another top tip, we'd recommend using kind of analytical language throughout your answer. And here are a couple of different examples of ones that we've pulled out of lots of different examiner reports where students have performed well because of some of the language they've used. Obviously, what they say before and after also matters, but these are really useful to practice using in your answers. So you may wish to pause the video and jot some of these down.
So the third question type then is our judgment essay. This is where you have a choice and it's either question 5 or question 6, depending which one you choose. Let's first of all take a look at the mark scheme. Katie, first of all, how's the 16 mark scheme similar to the 12 mark one we just talked about?
So the similarities are the inclusion of AO1 and AO2, the bits which in the previous one were in red and blue, and the wording there is exactly the same. So once you've mastered that for your 12 marker, you can use that very similar technique of applying knowledge and understanding and using that analytical language in exactly the same way.
Okay, that's great, thank you. So a lot of the skills are very similar, but obviously this is a 16 mark question, not 12, so there is a bit of a difference to it. So what's different about the mark scheme for this question?
Well, on this one, you can see that there's a third bullet point in each level of the mark scheme here. We've highlighted it in green. So here, what this question is asking you is really to make a judgment. You're given a statement and you're asked whether you agree. So for a level 1, you might have missed out your judgment or it's asserted. Level 2, the overall judgment might be a bit insecure. Level 3, we're looking for some justification and some criteria, which we'll talk about in a moment. And for really secure answers and really strong answers, a justified criteria is used and applied to make an overall judgment. So it's this element of judgment that's really different on the 16 marker compared to the 12.
Okay, thanks. And I notice in the mark scheme as well, in level 3 and 4, it again mentions that point of 3 or more aspects of content. So is it fair to say then that having some range of knowledge is quite important here as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Same rules apply. If you're not doing 3 or more different aspects of content, there is absolutely no access for level 4 or above. So you can't get higher than 12 marks or 11 marks.
Brilliant. So it's good to know that, because when revising, it's always good to make sure, thinking about reasons and causation and change, that you're thinking in terms of more than just 1 or 2 areas of knowledge. That's
Absolutely.
really helpful. Sometimes students struggle with getting started with this essay. They can find it a challenge. So do you have any suggestions for how students can approach starting this answer?
Well, actually, this is why I also agree that planning is step number 1. And then that just helps get all your ideas together. Once you've got that, then there are stronger ways to start. If we have a look at some of the examples, we've given you 3 different ones from 3 different questions. It doesn't so matter what the question is in these examples, but you should be able to spot a difference between them. So the first answer begins in 1948, something called the National Health Service, or NHS, was created. And for me, that is really kind of storytelling. It could almost be once upon a time in 1948, the NHS was created. And that's not really what we're looking for. We're looking for that focus on the question straight away and an understanding that you need to make a judgment, which is what the next one begins to do. So I somewhat agree with medieval care and treatment was effective. So there's a focus on the question and an element of judgment. But this is what we would definitely call sitting on the fence. I somewhat agree. It's not quite confident. This student probably hasn't planned their answer. So might not be the strongest in terms of that mark scheme for overall judgment. Now, the third answer, this is where the student's done really well. Despite the impact that transportation had on crimes, the impact of the bloody code was greater. So what the student's done is taken the factor, so transportation, which is probably given in the question, and gone, actually, I think this one, the impact of the bloody code, was far more important. So they're making a really clear judgment and outlining what their argument is going to be, hopefully, for the remainder of their essay.
Right, I see what you mean with those. Yeah, they must have planned, mustn't they, to have done that third example. They must have already figured out what they want to be saying in the answer.
Yeah, absolutely. And probably already worked out as well what order they're going to talk about it, which also helps.
Absolutely. So planning is key to a good start. Thanks for showing that. We mentioned a little bit ago about something called criteria. And some students can find that a little bit intimidating. They think, what on earth are criteria? What am I supposed to be talking about? The fact is, criteria are a lot simpler than many people think they are. So what do we mean when we say criteria? We really just mean having a good basis to justify the decision that you've made. Let's think about a question that has nothing to do with history. Let's talk about a general question. Why did you buy those trousers? Not a history question, not something you're likely to see on the exam paper, but we can use it to show what we mean by criteria. Imagine that you ask that question and the first person replies by saying, I chose this pair of trousers, they are the best. Well, They've given you a sort of answer to the question. They've said they bought them because they were the best. But the best at what? What made them the best? They haven't given a criteria. There's no way of knowing what they like about those trousers in particular. The second person, well, they give a slightly clearer criteria. We can start to see what it is that made them pick the trousers. They say, I chose this pair of trousers because they suited me the best. So now we're getting a sense that the decision they made was based on how they felt they looked when they put the trousers on. They're giving us a criteria or a reason for the decision. Person 3, however, well, they go a step further. They say, I chose this pair of trousers because, although others were a better fit or better price, this pair was the combination of the better quality and price, so more likely to last longer, and they were a good fit with the right length. That's a little bit more developed. We really can understand now why that person made the decision they made, because they've not only told us what's good about those, but they've also made a comparison to what it was they didn't choose about the others. Well, okay, we know that in your GCSE history exam, no one's going to ask you about your choice of clothes, but we can apply that principle to a history example. So let's take this question. This is from a migration paper, and even if you're not doing migration, we can apply this to any of the thematic studies. So the question says, in the years 1700 to present, the most significant impact of migrants in Britain was on the economy. The question's looking for students to decide what the most significant impact was. Do they agree that it was the impact on the economy? Well, the first answer, it does make a judgment, but it isn't supported with criteria. It says the most significant impact of migrants was on the economy. In other words, they're agreeing with the statement. But why? What made the impact of migrants on the economy more important than other impacts? We can't tell from that answer. There's no criteria. The second one, well, it starts to show us the criteria for making that choice. It says the most significant impact of migrants was on the economy because of the money they made for Britain. Well, now we're getting a sense of what the criteria is. We can tell that the reason they think that this is so important was because of the money being made. But why was that more important than the other impacts? It's not really clear why that money was more important than other things. The last example starts to show us why they've made that judgment. It says the most significant impact of migrants was on the economy because, although they encouraged changes to civil rights, the financial impact was felt by all in Britain and has lasted the longest with staffing in the NHS or the creation of businesses like M&S. So now we can see why this candidate thinks that the economic impact was so much more important than the other impacts. They're telling us that it's about the extent of impact on all people in Britain and how long lasting it was through the creation of things like shops like M&S and staffing for the NHS. In other words, even though that's not a very long judgment, we can tell exactly why they've made their decision. Not every exam question with a judgment will have the same criteria. You have to pick criteria that are appropriate for your question. But there are a few types of criteria that you might think about. For example, how wide-reaching was the change? In other words, how many people did it affect? How many people's lives were changed? Was this something that affected many people or just a few people? Did it affect only the rich? Did it affect only the poor? Did it affect men more than women? And so on. How widely was it accepted? Some changes are widely accepted by many people. Others might take time to be accepted. How long did the change last? What was its legacy? How rapid or slow was the change? When did it gain momentum? Was there a particular point when change sped up or slowed down? How significant was the change? Or was that change a turning point or a moment when many things in history developed because this change had happened? In other words, a good judgment answer will include one or more criteria which show why you've made the judgment you've made. It isn't just about saying you agree or disagree, it's about justifying it by saying what has led you to that conclusion. So let's take a look at what that might look like in a judgment for a historical answer. So here's two examples. The first one says, in conclusion, the most significant impact was culture, as it is still embedded in today's society as much as it was back then. So they're assessing the impact and how significant it was in terms of how long term it affected historical events. The second one says, I agree Robert Peel's work was the most significant change in law enforcement in the years 1700 to 1900 because of his impact on ending the bloody code and establishing the Metropolitan Police, which then allowed the police to grow, which both had a huge impact on law enforcement. So again, by showing why that impact mattered, they're justifying that they're saying that Robert Peel's work was the most significant change. That criteria justifies the judgment that they've reached. Katie, perhaps you might show us what this might look in an answer. I know the answer you're going to show us in a moment is missing some of the paragraphs. It's just a part of it, but perhaps using what is there, you could just show us what this might look like.
Of course, if we pick up on that Robert Peel one, because I really like the way that the student has written that one. So at the top here, I've just given you the full question. So Robert Peel's work was the most significant change in law enforcement in the year 1700 to 1900. And what you can see really nicely through the green highlighting is the sustained nature of this argument. The student doesn't just mention their judgment at the beginning. They don't just mention it at the end in their conclusion, but it features throughout their paragraphs. So this student really effectively keeps coming back to their judgment, which is what we're really looking for. So it talks about the long-term impact, the kind of scale of change that's come about as a result of the work of Robert Peel. So by establishing the Met Police, Robert Peel allowed the police to spread. So this student has really picked up on Robert Peel being a catalyst for change or a turning point for change, and keeps coming back to that. And at the end there, it says his work had very long-term impact and led to changes in law enforcement through the whole country. So again, talking about the extent of change over time, but also in terms of scale. And I'm sure this student has looked at banks of words like that one that you showed us earlier, Ben, of language to really help them describe change or continuity, and is using them really effectively in their answer here.
So speaking of the language that we mentioned, in pink, you can also see some of that key language being used to focus analytically on this answer. So at the beginning, they refer to the most significant change. It's a nice simple phrase, but it's really effective. They talk about his impact in the middle of the first paragraph. Again, we've got other language, the most significant change in law enforcement, dramatically changed, a huge change, completely changed. And so as it goes through with this pink language, we're getting this continual focus not only on the question, but also on the use of language, which helps drive the answer forward and keep it focused on engaging with the question. And I know, Katie, we've mentioned a couple of times the importance of planning. But I think, again, it just really does stand out with this answer. There's no way that this candidate could have written such a well-focused question if they hadn't taken a few moments at the beginning to get their head around how they wanted to answer the question.
Definitely agree. I don't think even I would attempt to answer this question without planning, so absolutely would be advising students to do so.
Yeah, completely agree with you there. Planning is so important on this. So what about revision? Now we've talked through the different questions, While you will be getting yourself ready to revise for the summer exams, are there any ways you can help yourself out by making your revision time more effective? There's lots of different ways to revise, and different methods suit different people. However, we have a few suggestions of ways that you might benefit in using your time. So one of the suggestions here is to think about those key factors. And remember, we said earlier, the key factors depend a little depending which option you're doing. Here you've got one which has individuals, institutions, church and government, science and technology, attitudes in society. And it's been divided down the left side into the 4 time periods. Now, those 4 time periods haven't just been made up. They're the 4 key topic areas, or the 4 key time periods found within the specification. And exam questions are often based around or fit within these time periods. So here's examples of how you can think about the content. In terms of individuals, for example, for the medieval period, who was influencing medicine in the medieval period, making sure you know who the key individuals were. Similarly, for science and technology, take, for example, the period 1700 to 1900, the 18th and 19th centuries. What new technology was available in this period? What discoveries were made? By focusing on those key factors and these key time periods, it's more effective for making sure that you've structured your knowledge so that you use the right knowledge when it's relevant for the question. Another key area of revision is about knowing the chronology of some of the key developments. Now, don't panic. We don't want you to worry overly much on the dates in this, in the sense that this thematic paper is not a test of you remembering every single date and year in great precision. You don't necessarily have to be able to remember every single specific date. However, you do have to understand how these key developments fit in to the overall chronology. So, for example, with these ones that are on the screen, we have germ theory, invention of the printing press, creation of the NHS and the Royal Society. It is important that you can fit them into their approximate places on this overall thematic time screen. So knowing, for example, that the Royal Society lands in the Renaissance period is crucial. Understanding that the invention of the printing press happens towards the end of medieval and becomes a major factor in the Renaissance period. Understanding that germ theory, the work of Pasteur, was not developed until the 19th century. Absolutely crucial, because if you were answering a question at the 18th century, for example, you wouldn't want to be talking about the germ theory, which wouldn't exist for the best part of a century later. And similarly, in the modern period, the NHS, a relatively modern development in British medicine. So understanding your key developments for your topic and how they fit into the timeline is absolutely crucial. Additionally, you need to make sure that you know the right pieces of knowledge. One of the best ways to do this is to go back to the document that lists all of the knowledge for this topic, the document we call the specification. And your teacher will be able to help you to find this if you haven't already got access to it. But as you can see on here, the purple circles, and this is from the crime and punishment option, the purple circles highlight some of the key language and some of the key developments that you need to be confident talking about. For example, the word vagabondage or witchcraft, or further down, bloody code and the name of an individual, Matthew Hopkins. Since all of these are named within the specification, it's really important that you take the time to make sure that you're confident in using this language and knowing what they all are. Of course, on the screen right now, this is from Crime and Punishment, and it's just one of the 4 time periods. You need to make sure that if you're going to use this, you know all 4 time periods for your thematic study. One way of using that knowledge is to be able to make notes or flashcards. So taking one example from this, which is the witchcraft circle, you could make a note of what is it, who was involved, why did the trials intensify during this period, and what was the punishment for witches. It would be a good idea as well, perhaps on the back of the card, to summarize the answer, not by writing many, many lines of detailed notes, but by getting the key pieces of information down so that you can remember them easily. Flashcards and notes like this are great, not only for testing yourself, but also for asking someone else to test you and make sure you've remembered the key knowledge. You could equally do it the other way around. Here you have the name Matthew Hopkins, and then on the back you could write several bullet points of key information and again ask someone to test you, or use it to test yourself by turning it face down, checking what you can remember, and then turning the card over to see if what you've remembered matches the notes you've made on the back. Of course, as we already said, there's many ways of revising. These are just some examples. Why not discuss other options with your teacher? They'll have many different ways that you could think of revising for this topic. So we hope this video has been useful. We've gone through section B of paper 1, the thematic study. Obviously, paper 1, which includes the historic environment, is just one section of your GCSE history. So we hope you'll take the time to watch our other videos, which will cover the 2 parts of paper 2 as well as paper 3. But thank you very much for watching this video.